Hey guys, tonight we journey into the smoky, filthy, and surprisingly lethal world of medieval taverns. Those legendary gathering places where survival meant more than just avoiding the food poisoning, and where a single wrong word could earn you a knife between the ribs. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're trudging through the muddy streets of 14th century London, your boots squelching through a mixture of horse dung, rotting vegetables, and things you'd rather not identify. The rain has been falling for 3 days straight, turning every road into a river of filth. Your stomach growls with a hunger that gnaws at your very soul, and your throat burns with a thirst that water alone cannot quench. In the distance, through the gray mist and smoke, you see it, a wooden sign creaking in the wind, painted with a crude image of a boar's head. The warm glow of firelight spills from small windows, and the sound of laughter and shouting drifts through the heavy wooden door. You've found a tavern, and whether you know it or not, you're about to enter a world that operates by its own rules. The first thing that hits you upon pushing open that door isn't the sight or the sound. It's the smell, a complex bouquet of aromas that assaults your nostrils with the subtlety of a mailed fist. Imagine, if you will, the concentrated essence of unwashed humanity mixed with the sour tang of spilled ale, the acrid smoke of poorly ventilated fires, and the mysterious but unmistakable odor of things that have been left to ferment in dark corners for far too long. It's the kind of smell that makes your eyes water and your stomach flip, yet somehow, after a few minutes, you barely notice it anymore. Funny how human adaptability works, isn't it? The floors beneath your feet are typically nothing more than packed earth covered with a layer of rushes, long grasses that are supposed to absorb spills and provide some semblance of cleanliness. In theory, these rushes are changed regularly. In practice, they often remain in place for months, slowly composting into a rich ecosystem of decomposing organic matter, spilled food, and the occasional small corpse of whatever vermin had been unlucky enough to meet its end in the tavern's depths. Walking across these floors is like traversing a spongy, unpredictable landscape. Your feet might sink into soft spots where ale has soaked through to the earth below, or crunch on the bones of long-forgotten meals. Historians still argue whether some establishments changed their rushes seasonally or simply waited until the smell became unbearable. But either way, you're walking on what amounts to a medieval petri dish. The more upscale establishments might have actual wooden floors, but even these are stained dark with years of spills and marked with the scars of countless knife fights and dice games gone wrong. The walls, constructed of wattle and daub, a mixture of wooden strips woven together and covered with mud, straw, and yes, animal dung, are blackened with smoke and grease. They sweat moisture in the winter and radiate heat in the summer, creating a microclimate that's perpetually uncomfortable. Some taverns might display crude paintings or carvings on these walls, often depicting religious scenes or royal heraldry, depending on the establishment's clientele and the owner's sense of propriety, or lack thereof. But it's the ceiling that truly completes the atmospheric experience. Low, oppressive, and blackened with decades of smoke, it seems to press down on the occupants like a physical weight. Massive wooden beams support the structure above, and from these beams hang all manner of objects. Dried herbs that do little to mask the prevailing odors, strings of onions and garlic, sides of bacon or ham in various stages of preservation, and sometimes the less savory remnants of customers who had failed to pay their debts. Nothing says, "Pay your tab," quite like a visual reminder dangling overhead, right? The lighting comes primarily from the great hearth that dominates one wall, its flames casting dancing shadows that make every face look sinister and every corner seem to hide potential threats. Candles, when they can be afforded, provide additional illumination, but their flickering light only adds to the sense of unease. The smoke from both fire and candles has nowhere to go but up, where it collects under the low ceiling before eventually finding its way out through gaps in the thatch or crude smoke holes. In this environment, every breath is an adventure. The air is thick enough to chew, laden with particles of soot, grease, and the exhalations of dozens of people who consider bathing a seasonal activity at best. Yet, for all its assault on the senses, there is something undeniably alive about a medieval tavern. The very air seems to pulse with energy, with the raw vitality of people living life at its most basic level. This is humanity stripped of pretense, reduced to its essential elements: the need for food, drink, companionship, and the occasional release of violence. As your eyes adjust to the dim light and your lungs adapt to the thick air, you begin to make out the figures that populate this smoky underworld. Merchants counting coins with suspicious eyes, soldiers still wearing the mud of distant battlefields, craftsmen celebrating the completion of difficult commissions, and locals who seem to have grown from the very floorboards themselves. So perfectly do they blend with their surroundings. The tavern keeper, usually a man of substantial girth and questionable morals, presides over this chaos like a king over his court. His word is law within these walls, and his justice is swift and often brutal. He knows every customer's name, their debts, their secrets, and their weaknesses. His wife, if he has one, is often equally formidable, wielding a wooden spoon or rolling pin with the skill of a trained warrior. This is the world you've entered when you pushed through that heavy wooden door. A world where the normal rules of society are suspended, where anything can happen, and where the only certainty is uncertainty itself. Not all medieval drinking establishments were created equal, and understanding the subtle but crucial differences between an inn, a tavern, and an alehouse could mean the difference between a comfortable night's rest and waking up in a ditch with your purse missing and your head ringing like a church bell. At the top of this hierarchy stood the inns, the aristocrats of the hospitality world. These establishments were primarily designed to house travelers, offering not just food and drink, but actual beds, or at least something that resembled beds. more than it resembled a pile of straw. The better inns were substantial buildings, often constructed of stone rather than the more common wood and daub, with multiple stories and rooms that could accommodate merchants, pilgrims, and other travelers who had both the means and the need for overnight lodging. The Tabard Inn in Southwark, immortalized by Geoffrey Chaucer in his Canterbury Tales, was one such establishment where travelers could expect victuals of the best kind and wine that was both strong and pleasing. But even the finest inns had their peculiarities that would shock modern sensibilities. Privacy, as we understand it today, simply did not exist. Travelers were routinely packed into rooms like cargo, with 10 or 12 strangers sharing not just the same space, but often the same bed. The concept of individual accommodation was reserved for the very wealthy, and even then, it was more about status than comfort. The beds themselves were marvels of medieval engineering and endurance, constructed of rope or leather straps stretched across wooden frames. They supported mattresses stuffed with straw, feathers, or whatever organic material was available and affordable. These mattresses were rarely changed and never cleaned in any meaningful sense. They were home to entire ecosystems of fleas, lice, bedbugs, and other creatures that viewed human guests as nothing more than a convenient food source. Sharing a bed with strangers was not just uncomfortable, but potentially dangerous. Theft was common, as was violence born of disputes over space, snoring, or the various bodily functions that humans perform during sleep. Many travelers learned to sleep with one eye open and their most valuable possessions clutched tightly to their chests. Sweet dreams, indeed. Taverns occupied the middle ground of medieval hospitality. Originally, these establishments were the domain of vintners, wine merchants who sold their wares directly to the public. Wine was expensive, imported from France, Spain, or the Rhine region, and carried with it an air of sophistication that ale could never match. A gallon of decent red wine from Gascony might cost 3 pennies, twice the price of the finest ale, while Rhenish wine could command 6 to 8 pennies per gallon. For context, that's about a day's wages for a skilled craftsman. So you weren't exactly getting tipsy on the cheap. The wine trade was heavily regulated, and for good reason. Adulteration was common, with unscrupulous tavern keepers watering down their wine, mixing it with cheaper alternatives, or even creating entirely counterfeit versions using whatever ingredients they could find. The penalties for such deception were severe and public. A tavern keeper caught selling adulterated wine might find himself locked in the pillory with the offending liquid poured over his head, a form of punishment that combined public humiliation with poetic justice. Historians still debate whether this deterrent was effective or simply provided entertainment for the masses, but either way, it was certainly memorable. To combat fraud, customers had the right to inspect the wine they were purchasing. A suspicious patron could demand to be taken down to the cellar to see the actual barrel from which his wine was being drawn. This practice led to the development of elaborate cellars beneath many taverns, cool underground chambers where barrels of wine aged, and where the more discerning customers could verify the authenticity of their purchase. Wine criers, officials whose job it was to inspect and announce the quality and price of wine available in local taverns, roamed the streets calling out their findings. These men helped customers make informed decisions about where to spend their hard-earned coins. Though one suspects, they also enjoyed a fair amount of free samples in the course of their duties. As taverns evolved, they began to expand their offerings beyond wine. Cider made from apples, perry from pears, and mead from honey all found their way onto tavern tables. Some establishments began offering food as well, recognizing that hungry customers were thirsty customers, and that a man with food in his belly was more likely to linger and continue drinking. The transformation of taverns from wine shops to full-service establishments was gradual but inevitable, driven by profit and practicality in equal measure. At the bottom of the hospitality hierarchy were the alehouses, humble establishments that began as private homes where the housewife brewed more ale than her family could consume. These women, known as alewives, would signal the availability of fresh ale by hanging a stick or broom outside their door. A simple but effective form of medieval advertising. Ale was the lifeblood of medieval society, consumed by everyone from infants to the elderly because it was often safer than water. The brewing process, which involved boiling water, killed many of the harmful bacteria that made untreated water dangerous to drink. This wasn't understood in scientific terms, of course, but the practical effects were obvious enough. A typical alewife might brew several times a week, producing ale that would last only a few days before turning sour or developing off flavors. The quality varied enormously from house to house and batch to batch. Some alewives took pride in their craft, producing ale that was clear, flavorful, and properly fermented. Others were less scrupulous, selling ale that was weak, sour, or contaminated with whatever ingredients they had used to stretch their grain supplies. Breadcrumbs, herbs, and even less savory additives might find their way into a batch of ale, either by accident or design. Despite their humble origins, alehouses were subject to strict regulation. The Assize of Bread and Ale, enacted in 1266, tied the price of ale to the price of wheat and established quality standards that all brewers were expected to meet. Ale conners, sworn officials whose job was to test ale and ensure its quality, made regular rounds of alehouses, sampling the wares and ensuring that customers were getting what they paid for. The punishments for brewing bad ale or charging excessive prices were severe and public. Male brewers who violated the assize might find themselves locked in the pillory, while female brewers faced the tumbrel, not the massive siege engine, but a device designed to dump the offender repeatedly in the nearest body of water. A bit harsh, perhaps, but medieval quality control didn't mess around. Understanding these distinctions was crucial for any medieval traveler. Choose the wrong establishment, and you might find yourself paying in prices for alehouse quality, or worse, sleeping in a ditch because you couldn't afford the accommodations you had assumed would be available. The wise traveler learned to read the signs, literally and figuratively, that indicated what kind of establishment he was entering and what he could expect to find there. In a world where water could kill you faster than your enemies, alcohol wasn't just a luxury, it was a necessity. The medieval relationship with drink was fundamentally different from our modern understanding, shaped by practical concerns that made sobriety not just unpleasant, but potentially fatal. Water, the most basic of human needs, was often the most dangerous thing you could put in your mouth. Rivers served as highways, sewers, and dumping grounds all at once. The Thames in London was a flowing cocktail of human waste, animal carcasses, industrial runoff from tanneries and dye works, and the general detritus of urban life. Wells, when they existed, were frequently contaminated by seepage from nearby cesspits or graveyards. Even rainwater collected in barrels and cisterns quickly became breeding grounds for bacteria and parasites. So your choice was essentially this: drink water and gamble with dysentery, or drink ale and stay relatively healthy. Not exactly a difficult decision, is it? The solution was alcohol. The brewing and fermentation process, which required boiling water and produced ethanol, killed most of the harmful microorganisms that made water dangerous. This led to a society where alcohol consumption began at birth and continued until death. Infants were given weak ale or wine mixed with water. Children drank small beer, a low-alcohol beverage that provided calories and hydration without causing intoxication. Adults consumed stronger versions throughout the day, not to get drunk, but to stay alive and healthy. Imagine explaining that to your modern doctor. Yes, I give my toddler beer with breakfast. It's for his health. The brewing of ale was primarily women's work, a domestic skill passed down from mother to daughter, like cooking or weaving. An alewife's reputation rested on her ability to produce consistent, flavorful ale that would keep her family and customers healthy and satisfied. The process was both art and science, requiring knowledge of grain quality, water sources, fermentation timing, and the dozens of variables that could turn a promising batch into undrinkable swill. The basic ingredients were simple: malted barley, water, and yeast. The barley was soaked until it began to sprout, then dried to halt the germination process. This malting converted the grain starches into fermentable sugars. The malted barley was then mashed with hot water to extract these sugars, creating a sweet liquid called wort. Wild yeasts in the air would begin fermentation naturally, converting the sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide. But simplicity in ingredients didn't mean simplicity in execution. The quality of the barley affected everything. Grain that had been damaged by rain, frost, or pests would produce inferior ale. Hops, which would later become essential to beer brewing, were not widely used in medieval England until the 15th century. Instead, brewers relied on a mixture of herbs and spices called grite to flavor and preserve their ale. Bog myrtle, yarrow, heather, and dozens of other plants might be added to give ale its distinctive taste and help it keep longer. Some of these additives had psychoactive properties, adding an extra dimension to the drinking experience that modern beer lacks. One suspect's medieval hangovers were particularly interesting. The result was a beverage that bore little resemblance to modern beer. Medieval ale was cloudy, often thick enough to chew, and had a complex flavor profile that might include notes of herbs, spices, and whatever else the brewer had decided to add. It was typically consumed within a few days of brewing before it could turn sour or develop off flavors. The alcohol content varied widely, from the weak small beer given to children to stronger versions that could leave a grown man senseless. Wine occupied a different niche in medieval society, where ale was the drink of common people. Wine carried connotations of sophistication, wealth, and religious significance. The Christian Church's use of wine in communion gave it a sacred quality that ale could never match, while its higher cost made it a status symbol for those who could afford it. England's wine came primarily from its continental possessions and trading partners. Gascon wine from southwestern France was the most common, a red wine that was relatively affordable and traveled reasonably well. Rhenish wine from the German regions along the Rhine was more expensive, but prized for its quality. The wine trade was international commerce at its most complex. Merchants had to navigate not just the physical challenges of transportation. Wine could spoil, freeze, or turn to vinegar during long journeys, but also the political and economic obstacles created by wars, tariffs, and trade disputes. A barrel of wine that left Bordeaux in perfect condition might arrive in London as expensive vinegar if the journey took too long or the weather was unfavorable. Historians still debate whether medieval wine merchants were brilliant entrepreneurs or simply gluttons for punishment. But wine's prestige made it a target for fraud. Unscrupulous merchants might water down their wine, mix expensive varieties with cheaper ones, or create entirely counterfeit wines using whatever ingredients they could find. Alum, honey, herbs, and even more dangerous substances might be added to mimic the color, flavor, or effects of genuine wine. The penalties for such deception were severe, but the potential profits made the risks worthwhile for some. Mead, made from fermented honey, occupied a special place in medieval drinking culture, often called the drink of the gods. Mead was associated with celebration, ceremony, and the warrior culture of earlier ages. It was expensive to produce. Honey was a valuable commodity used for sweetening, medicine, and candle making, but its intoxicating effects and symbolic significance made it worth the cost for special occasions. The brewing of mead was more art than science, requiring careful attention to the ratio of honey to water, the temperature of fermentation, and the timing of various additions. All of these alcoholic beverages shared certain characteristics that distinguished them from their modern counterparts. They were living products, continuing to ferment and change even after they were served. They were unpredictable, with each batch potentially different from the last. They were often contaminated with bacteria, wild yeasts, and other microorganisms that could produce unexpected flavors and effects. And they were essential to life in a way that modern drinkers can barely comprehend. If the drink in medieval taverns was questionable, the food was often downright dangerous. Yet, for many people, the tavern meal was the best they could hope for. A hot, filling dish that might contain actual meat and vegetables, served in portions generous enough to satisfy even the hardiest appetite. The centerpiece of tavern cuisine was pottage, a thick stew that could contain virtually anything edible, and quite a few things that weren't. The concept was simple. Take a large cauldron, Fill it with water or broth. Add whatever ingredients were available and let it simmer until everything was tender enough to eat. The result was a dish that was different every day, sometimes different every hour, as new ingredients were added to replace what had been served. The perpetual stew, or hunter's pot, was the ultimate expression of this philosophy. A cauldron would be kept simmering constantly, with new ingredients added as old ones were consumed. In theory, this created a continuously evolving dish that never ran out and never repeated itself exactly. In practice, it created a breeding ground for bacteria and a repository for ingredients of questionable origin and dubious freshness. Some tavern keepers claimed their pottage had been simmering for years, which was either impressive dedication to the craft or absolutely terrifying, depending on your perspective. The base of most pottages was grain: barley, oats, wheat, or whatever was cheapest and most available. Vegetables were added when available: onions, leeks, cabbage, turnips, carrots, and whatever else could be found in the market or foraged from the countryside. Meat, when it appeared in pottage, was often of uncertain origin and questionable quality. Beef, pork, mutton, and chicken were the most common, but the cuts were typically tough, stringy, and well past their prime, the kind that required long, slow cooking to become even marginally edible. But it wasn't just the quality of the meat that was concerning. It was the source. Tavern keepers were not above using meat that had been rejected by other buyers, animals that had died of disease, or cuts that had been sitting in the market for days without finding a purchaser. The long cooking process would kill most harmful bacteria, but it couldn't eliminate the off flavors and textures that came with spoiled meat. Bread was the other staple of tavern meals, but like everything else, its quality varied enormously. The best taverns might serve white bread made from wheat flour, a luxury that was soft, flavorful, and relatively fresh. More commonly, customers received brown bread made from barley, rye, or mixed grains, often several days old and hard enough to use as a weapon. The worst bread was made from whatever grain was cheapest, often mixed with sawdust, ground acorns, or other fillers to stretch the flour. This bread was dense, gritty, and barely edible, but it provided calories and helped fill empty stomachs. Despite all these challenges, tavern food served an important social and nutritional function. For many people, especially those living in cities, the tavern meal was their primary source of hot cooked food. It provided calories, protein, and at least some vitamins and minerals that might be lacking in their regular diet. It was also a social experience, bringing people together around shared tables and creating opportunities for conversation, business, and community building. A bowl of well-made pottage served hot and accompanied by fresh bread and good ale could transform a cold, wet, miserable day into something bearable. It might not have been gourmet cuisine, but it was sustenance for both body and soul. Step into any medieval tavern, and you'd find yourself surrounded by a cast of characters that would make a modern crime novelist weep with envy. These weren't the sanitized peasants and noble knights of romantic literature, but real people living on the margins of society, each with their own story, their own agenda, and their own particular brand of danger. The merchants were perhaps the most visible and vocal of the tavern's regular patrons. These men, and they were almost exclusively men, traveled the dangerous roads between towns and cities, carrying goods, news, and often substantial amounts of coin. They were natural storytellers, regaling anyone who would listen with tales of distant markets, exotic goods, and the perils of the road. But beneath their jovial exteriors lay sharp minds constantly calculating profit and loss, and eyes that missed nothing of value. A successful merchant in a medieval tavern was like a walking advertisement for prosperity, dressed in fine clothes, sporting jewelry that proclaimed his wealth, and speaking with the confidence of a man who had seen the world beyond the village boundaries. But this display of wealth made him a target for every cut purse, confidence man, and outright robber in the establishment. Smart merchants traveled in groups, hired guards, and kept their most valuable possessions hidden. Even the most cautious could find themselves relieved of their goods by a clever thief or a well-planned ambush. The less successful merchants were often more dangerous than their prosperous counterparts. Desperate men with failing businesses, mounting debts, and families to feed were capable of almost anything. They might sell goods they didn't own, promise deliveries they couldn't make, or enter into partnerships with criminals to recoup their losses. A merchant on the edge of bankruptcy was a man with nothing left to lose, and such men were unpredictable and potentially violent. Nothing quite like financial ruin to bring out humanity's creative side. Really, soldiers were another common sight in medieval taverns, and their presence could either ensure peace or guarantee trouble depending on their mood, their sobriety, and their recent experiences. Veterans of foreign wars brought with them not just scars and stories, but also a casual attitude toward violence that could turn a simple disagreement into a bloodbath. They were skilled with weapons, accustomed to taking what they needed, and often suffering from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. The best soldiers were disciplined professionals who understood that their reputation was their most valuable asset. They might be hired as guards, escorts, or enforcers, and their presence in a tavern could actually make it safer for other patrons. But even good soldiers could be pushed too far, especially when drink loosened their tongues and old grievances surfaced. The worst soldiers were little better than bandits with military training, deserters, discharged veterans with no other skills, and mercenaries between contracts often turned to crime to survive. Pilgrims represented a different kind of danger, not physical violence, but moral corruption. These supposedly holy travelers were often the most worldly people in the tavern, having seen more of life than the local residents could imagine. Some were genuine seekers of spiritual enlightenment, but others were using pilgrimage as an excuse for adventure, escape from legal troubles, or simply an extended vacation from the responsibilities of home. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales gives us a vivid picture of medieval pilgrims, and it's not always flattering. His pilgrims include a corrupt pardoner selling fake relics, a summoner who takes bribes to overlook sins, and a wife who has buried 5 husbands and is looking for number 6. These were people who understood how to manipulate religious sentiment for personal gain, and they were often more dangerous than the obvious criminals because they hid their true nature behind a facade of piety. Historians still debate whether Chaucer was exaggerating for comic effect or simply reporting what he observed. Craftsmen and artisans formed another significant group in the tavern population. These skilled workers, blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers, potters, and dozens of other trades, were the backbone of the medieval economy. They were generally more prosperous than common laborers, but less wealthy than successful merchants, occupying a middle ground that made them both envied and resented by those above and below them on the social ladder. Guild membership gave craftsmen a certain status and protection, but it also created rivalries and conflicts that could spill over into violence. Different guilds competed for customers, disputed territorial boundaries, and fought over the right to practice certain trades. A tavern might become neutral ground where these disputes could be settled, or it might become a battlefield where old grudges were settled with fists and knives. Women in medieval taverns occupied a complex and often dangerous position. The alewives who ran many establishments were businesswomen in their own right, but they were also vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft, adultery, or other crimes that could destroy their reputations and their livelihoods. Serving wenches faced constant harassment and the threat of sexual violence, while prostitutes operated in a legal gray area that left them at the mercy of both customers and authorities. But medieval women were not passive victims. Many were skilled in the use of knives, poisons, and other weapons, and they were often more ruthless than their male counterparts when threatened. A tavern keeper's wife might be the real power behind the establishment, using her knowledge of customers' secrets and weaknesses to maintain order and extract payment. Female criminals often used their supposed weakness and innocence as weapons, luring victims into traps or manipulating men into doing their bidding. Never underestimate a woman who's learned to survive in a man's world, especially one where survival requires creativity. Thieves and cutpurses were the most obvious criminals in any tavern, but they were also often the most skilled at blending in with legitimate customers. The best thieves were indistinguishable from honest merchants, craftsmen, or travelers until the moment they struck. They studied their victims carefully, learning their habits, their weaknesses, and the location of their valuables before making their move. Professional thieves often worked in teams, with one member creating a distraction while another picked pockets or cut purse strings. They might pose as fellow travelers, sympathetic listeners, or potential business partners to get close to their victims. The most successful thieves were those who could steal without their victims even realizing they had been robbed until hours or days later. But not all thieves were professionals. Desperate people driven to crime by poverty, debt, or other circumstances were often clumsy and dangerous. They might resort to violence when stealth failed, turning a simple theft into assault or murder. These amateur criminals were unpredictable and often more dangerous than their professional counterparts because they had no reputation to protect and no code of conduct to follow. The tavern keeper himself was often the most dangerous person in the establishment. He controlled the environment, knew all the customers, and had the authority to settle disputes or call for help from local authorities. But he was also a businessman operating in a gray area of the law, and his survival depended on his ability to balance the competing interests of customers, suppliers, and officials. A corrupt tavern keeper might fence stolen goods, provide alibis for criminals, or arrange for the elimination of troublesome customers. He might water down drinks, serve spoiled food, or charge excessive prices to customers who were too drunk or too intimidated to complain. His establishment might serve as a meeting place for criminal conspiracies, a safe house for fugitives, or a base of operations for organized crime. Even honest tavern keepers had to make moral compromises to survive, looking the other way when crimes were committed on their premises or accepting payment from criminals for their silence. This rogues gallery of medieval tavern patrons created an atmosphere of constant tension and unpredictability. Alliances formed and dissolved based on immediate needs and opportunities. Trust was a luxury that few could afford, and betrayal was always just a drink away. In this environment, survival depended on one's ability to read people quickly, assess threats accurately, and respond appropriately to changing circumstances. Yet for all its dangers, the medieval tavern served an important social function. It was one of the few places where people from different social classes, professions, and backgrounds could interact on relatively equal terms. A merchant might share a table with a craftsman, a soldier might drink with a priest, and a noble might find himself gambling with a thief. These interactions, however brief and superficial, helped to break down some of the rigid social barriers that characterized medieval society. The tavern was also a place where information flowed freely. News, gossip, rumors, and secrets were traded like commodities, and a skilled listener could learn more in a single evening than he might discover in weeks of formal inquiry. In the flickering candlelight of medieval taverns, fortunes were won and lost with the roll of dice, the turn of a card, or the outcome of contests that tested both skill and luck. Gambling wasn't just entertainment, it was a way of life, a means of social advancement, and often a path to ruin that claimed victims from every level of society. Dice were the most popular gambling implements in medieval taverns, and for good reason. They were small, portable, and could be made from readily available materials like bone, wood, or stone. The basic concept was simple enough that even the most illiterate peasant could understand it, yet complex enough to sustain interest through long nights of play. But medieval dice games were far from the standardized casino games of today. They were wild, unpredictable affairs where the rules changed with the players, and cheating was considered more of an art form than a crime. The most common dice game was hazard, a precursor to modern craps that involved betting on the outcome of dice throws. The player would call a number between 5 and 9 as his main, then attempt to roll that number before rolling certain other combinations that would cause him to lose. It sounds simple, but the betting possibilities were endless, with side wagers on individual throws, sequences of throws, and the performance of other players, creating a complex web of financial obligations that could bankrupt a man in minutes. One bad streak, and you might find yourself wagering your boots, your horse, or in truly desperate cases, your freedom. The dice themselves were often works of art, carved from the bones of exotic animals or crafted from precious materials like ivory or jet. Wealthy players might own sets of dice made from different materials for different games, while poor players made do with crude wooden cubes that were barely symmetrical. But regardless of their construction, all dice were suspect. Loaded dice, shaved dice, and dice with duplicate numbers were common, and players developed elaborate rituals for inspecting dice before play began. The most skilled dice players were those who could cheat without being detected. They might use sleight of hand to substitute loaded dice for fair ones, employ confederates to distract other players at crucial moments, or use subtle signals to coordinate their betting with accomplices. The best cheaters were so skilled that they could manipulate the outcome of games while appearing to be the victims of bad luck themselves. Historians still debate whether professional gamblers were genuinely more skilled or simply better at concealing their methods. But dice weren't the only gambling games in medieval taverns. Cards, though less common than dice, were growing in popularity throughout the later medieval period. Medieval card games bore little resemblance to modern poker or blackjack. Primero, an ancestor of poker, involved betting on the strength of one's hand. But the hand rankings were different from modern poker, and the betting structure was more fluid and unpredictable. The most dangerous aspect of medieval card games wasn't the games themselves, but the accusations of cheating that inevitably arose. Marked cards, dealing from the bottom of the deck, and collusion between players were common, but proving cheating was difficult and often led to violence. A player accused of cheating might find himself facing not just the loss of his winnings, but a knife in the ribs or a challenge to single combat. Nothing quite ruins a card game like someone drawing steel instead of another card. Beyond dice and cards, medieval taverns hosted a bewildering variety of gambling activities. Arm wrestling contests, drinking competitions, and tests of skill or knowledge all became opportunities for wagering. Customers might bet on which of two flies would reach the ceiling first, whether the next person through the door would be male or female, or how many beans were in a jar. Anything that had an uncertain outcome could become the subject of a wager. Cockfighting was particularly popular in taverns that had outdoor space or could accommodate the noise and mess of the sport. Two roosters, specially bred and trained for fighting, would be placed in a pit while spectators bet on the outcome. The fights were brutal and often ended in the death of one or both birds, but the excitement and betting opportunities made them irresistible to many tavern patrons. The social dynamics of gambling in medieval taverns were complex and often dangerous. Winning too much too quickly could mark a player as a cheat or a target for robbery. Losing too much could lead to desperate attempts to recoup losses that often ended in violence or crime. The most successful gamblers were those who could win consistently without appearing to be too skilled or too lucky. Professional gamblers, known as dicers or card sharps, traveled from tavern to tavern, making their living from their skill at games of chance. They were often welcomed by tavern keepers because they attracted customers and generated business, but they were also viewed with suspicion by local players who resented being outplayed by outsiders. The best professional gamblers were those who could lose gracefully when necessary, winning just enough to make a living without arousing too much suspicion or resentment. But gambling in medieval taverns wasn't just about money. Social status, reputation, and honor were also at stake. A nobleman who lost consistently to a peasant might find his social standing damaged, while a merchant who was caught cheating might find his business reputation ruined. The stakes were often higher than the actual money involved, and the consequences of losing could extend far beyond the tavern walls. The psychology of gambling in medieval taverns was shaped by the harsh realities of medieval life. For most people, life was a constant struggle against poverty, disease, and early death. Gambling offered the possibility, however remote, of escaping these constraints through a single lucky throw of the dice or turn of cards. It was a form of hope, however irrational, that tomorrow might be better than today. Violence in medieval taverns wasn't an aberration. It was an integral part of the social fabric, as expected and inevitable as the sunrise. In a world where might often made right and personal honor was worth more than life itself, the tavern served as both pressure valve and proving ground for the aggressive impulses that simmered beneath the surface of medieval society. The causes of tavern violence were as varied as the people who frequented these establishments. A perceived slight, a disputed debt, a woman's honor, a political disagreement, or simply too much ale could spark a confrontation that might end in bloodshed. But understanding the triggers was less important than understanding the culture that made violence not just acceptable, but often necessary for survival and social standing. Honor was the currency of medieval society, and it was a currency that could be devalued by a single moment of perceived cowardice or disrespect. A man who allowed himself to be insulted without response might find his reputation permanently damaged, affecting not just his social standing, but his ability to conduct business, attract a wife, or command respect from his peers. In this context, violence wasn't just an option. It was often the only option for maintaining one's place in society. The weapons available in medieval taverns were limited by law and custom, but creativity and desperation could turn almost anything into an instrument of death. Knives were the most common weapons, carried by virtually everyone for eating and general utility. These weren't the small table knives of modern times, but substantial blades capable of inflicting serious wounds. A skilled knife fighter could kill an opponent in seconds, while even an amateur could cause significant damage in the close quarters of a crowded tavern. More commonly, tavern fighters made do with improvised weapons. Wooden stools became clubs, pottery shards became cutting implements, and even eating utensils could be pressed into service as weapons. The heavy pewter or wooden tankards used for drinking ale were particularly effective as bludgeons, capable of crushing skulls or breaking bones with a single well-placed blow. Resourcefulness was the key. If you couldn't afford a proper weapon, you simply made do with whatever was within arm's reach. The role of women in tavern violence was complex and often underestimated. While women were less likely to engage in direct physical confrontation, they were often the instigators of violence, using their relationships with men to manipulate conflicts for their own benefit. A woman might encourage her lover to fight a rival, provide weapons or information to one side in a conflict, or use accusations of sexual impropriety to destroy an enemy's reputation. When women did engage in physical violence, they were often more vicious and unpredictable than their male counterparts. Female tavern keepers were known for their ability to maintain order through a combination of intimidation and violence, wielding rolling pins, ladles, and other kitchen implements with deadly efficiency. Serving wenches learned to defend themselves against unwanted advances using whatever weapons were at hand, and their intimate knowledge of the tavern's layout gave them significant advantages in close combat. The aftermath of tavern violence was often as dangerous as the violence itself. Wounded fighters might die from their injuries days or weeks later, turning what had seemed like a minor altercation into a case of murder. Families and friends of the injured or killed might seek revenge, creating cycles of violence that could persist for generations. Legal authorities might become involved, leading to trials, executions, or other forms of official punishment that could destroy entire families. But violence also served important social functions in medieval taverns. It was a way of establishing and maintaining social hierarchies, with stronger or more skilled fighters earning respect and deference from their peers. It was a form of entertainment for spectators who might bet on the outcome of fights, or simply enjoy the excitement of watching others risk their lives. It was a method of dispute resolution in a society where formal legal mechanisms were often unavailable or ineffective. In the shadowy corners and upstairs rooms of medieval taverns, another ancient profession plied its trade with a mixture of desperation, cunning, and resigned acceptance of society's moral contradictions. Prostitution wasn't just tolerated in medieval taverns. It was often an integral part of the business model, providing additional income for tavern keepers and additional services for customers who had coin to spend and appetites to satisfy. The women who worked as prostitutes in medieval taverns came from all walks of life, though poverty was the common thread that bound their stories together. Some were widows who had lost their husbands to war, disease, or accident, and had no other means of supporting themselves and their children. Others were young women who had been seduced and abandoned, their reputations ruined, and their prospects for marriage destroyed. Still others were simply products of a society that offered few legitimate opportunities for women to earn a living wage. The Church officially condemned prostitution as a mortal sin, but even religious authorities recognized its practical necessity. St. Augustine had argued that prostitution was like sewers in a palace, unpleasant but necessary to prevent worse corruption. This pragmatic approach led to a complex system of regulation and tolerance that varied widely from place to place and time to time. The working conditions for prostitutes in medieval taverns were harsh and dangerous. They had little protection from violent or abusive customers, no recourse when clients refused to pay, and constant exposure to sexually transmitted diseases that could be disfiguring or fatal. Pregnancy was an occupational hazard that could end a woman's career, and the primitive methods of birth control and abortion available at the time were often more dangerous than childbirth itself. But prostitution in medieval taverns wasn't just about sex. It was about companionship, entertainment, and emotional connection. Many customers were lonely men far from home who valued conversation and affection as much as physical gratification. Successful prostitutes learned to be actresses, therapists, and confidants, as well as sexual partners, adapting their personalities to meet the emotional needs of their clients. Justice in medieval taverns was a complex and often contradictory affair, where official law enforcement competed with unofficial systems of order, and where the line between legal authority and criminal enterprise was often blurred beyond recognition. The tavern existed in a legal gray area, simultaneously subject to royal authority, church jurisdiction, guild regulations, and local customs that might contradict each other in fundamental ways. The most visible representatives of official law enforcement were the constables, bailiffs, and other officers who were responsible for maintaining order in their jurisdictions. These men were often part-time officials who combined law enforcement duties with other occupations, and their effectiveness varied widely based on their personal courage, political connections, and financial resources. But the most effective form of law enforcement in medieval taverns was often the informal system of social control exercised by the tavern keeper and regular customers. A strong tavern keeper could maintain order through a combination of personal authority, physical intimidation, and economic incentives, while regular customers might police each other's behavior to protect their favorite establishment from official interference. Corruption was endemic in medieval law enforcement, and taverns were both a source and a target of corrupt practices. Officials might accept bribes to overlook illegal activities, participate in the profits of criminal enterprises, or use their authority to extort money from tavern keepers and customers. The line between law enforcement and organized crime was often so blurred as to be invisible as dawn broke over the medieval world, painting the sky in shades of gray and gold. The taverns that had pulsed with life throughout the night began their slow transformation back to something resembling respectability. But the evidence of the previous evening's activities lingered: bloodstains on the floor, broken furniture in the corners, and the hollow-eyed stares of those who had gambled away their futures on the turn of a card or the roll of dice. The morning after was when the true cost of tavern life became apparent, and when survivors began the difficult process of reconciling what had happened with who they thought they were. And so we come to the end of our journey through the smoky, dangerous, endlessly fascinating world of medieval taverns. You've walked those sticky floors, breathed that impossible air, shared tables with merchants and thieves, watched fortunes change hands in moments, and witnessed the raw humanity that made these establishments both terrifying and strangely alive. The medieval tavern was never just a place to drink. It was a mirror held up to society itself, reflecting both our noblest aspirations and our basest instincts. Often in the same breath, these establishments survived because they met fundamental human needs that no amount of official disapproval could suppress: the need for community, for escape, for the possibility of transformation. However fleeting, they were places where the rigid structures of medieval life temporarily dissolved, where a lucky peasant might drink with nobility, where an unlucky merchant might lose everything, where anyone might become someone else, at least until morning. In their filth and chaos, their violence and tenderness, their exploitation and genuine connection, medieval taverns were profoundly, impossibly human. And perhaps that's the real truth we've uncovered tonight, that in seeking to understand these long-vanished establishments, we've really been examining ourselves, our own contradictions, our own eternal search for meaning in spaces where ordinary rules don't quite apply. So if you enjoyed tonight's journey into history's grimmiest corners, let me know in the comments which aspect of tavern life surprised you most. Your watch time, your thoughts, and your presence here tonight means everything. Until next time, may your own evenings be considerably cleaner, safer, and less likely to end in a knife fight. Sweet dreams.